been made by innocent bystanders. Mr. Maurice Willows, Director of Red Cross Relief.
A tent city was constructed to house refugees. Embarrassed city officials, white newspapers, the clergy, and the Chamber of Commerce perpetuated the myth that white Tulsa had an outpouring of aid into the devastated black community. In fact, just the opposite was true.
With homes looted, homes and stores burned to ashes, with sick, aged, and enfeebled carried out or left to perish in the flames, mothers giving birth to children in the open, herded, guarded, and corralled like prisoners of war. And before the smoke of 1,000 homes had blown away, the trembling and homeless learned that the city fathers had passed an ordinance making it forever impossible for them, in their destitute condition, to go back and rebuild on their home place. G.A. Gregg.
The city council, or commissioners, passed an ordinance that there could be no construction in the city of Tulsa that was not fireproof. Now, with people absolutely without any resources, it was impossible for them to conform to any requirement that they rebuild only fireproof structures. And my father said, you build, if they arrest you, I'll get you out of jail, you can go on building. And my dad had challenged the constitutionality of that city ordinance. And the Supreme Court of the state of Oklahoma declared that ordinance unconstitutional as being a frivolous piece of legislation designed to keep blacks down.
With their hearts bleeding, their homes, and all of the relics that make the memories of life's past sustaining, with shocking realization that their families are broken and scattered and fearing the mob, with trembly, weak, hungry, and hungerless bodies compelled to be in the stalls of the fairgrounds under a heavy, cruel guard who greets them with harsh orders and vulgar language, while suffering all this and more. The mayor, commissioners, the real estate exchange, the welfare board are like those who crucified Christ, casted lots for the Negro's hard-earned land. G.A. Gregg.
Not only was the area declared a fire zone, which effectively was designed to prevent it from being rebuilt, but then amazingly, just incredibly, the city fathers put the land up for sale.
Through the Reconstruction Committee appointed by the mayor and city commissioners June 14th, Tulsa extends a welcoming hand to wholesale houses and industrial plants, which are to be located on the trackage property in Little Africa, swept by fire, and which is now within the city fire limits, restricted to the erection of fire-resisting buildings. The committee also expressed a sentiment in favor of using a part of the burned area for a Union Station whenever such a project is ready for consideration by the railroads entering Tulsa. Tulsa World, June 15th, 1921.
In order to help people get in touch with their loved ones who were anxious to hear from them, Mr. Theo Bowman, the Oklahoma Sun, succeeded in getting out a little daily paper. Each day, he would publish these lists. Each day, people sat under the tent and watched for these lists as well as the lists of dead in the big dailies. The dead were so quickly disposed of on that night and day until it was impossible to ever get an exact record of the dead and wounded.
A cousin and I decided to go visit somebody, and we passed down by the cemetery there at 11th and Lewis, the old Oak Lawn Cemetery. And as we went down 11th Street, we saw a bunch of men working, digging a pit, evidently, and we noticed a bunch of wooden crates lying around. So we were very curious about it, so we went in to have a look. And we walked up to the first crate, and we were unnoticed by the men. And we opened the first crate, looked in, and there were the bodies of 3 black men. We shut the lid down real quick and proceeded to go over to the next crate, which is much larger, and opened it, and there was at least 4 bodies in that crate. They were all just piled in there. And about that time, the men noticed us and ran us out.
The Red Cross estimated that 300 people were killed. The official death toll was placed at 36. Terrified witnesses told of bodies being disposed of at city incinerators, the Arkansas River, and local strip mining pits. When one witness was asked about the difference between the Red Cross totals and the city's official count, the reply was, there is no statute of limitations on murder.
I had a friend of mine named Bill Wilbanks, who at that time was a captain in the Tulsa Police Department. And he called me and he said, would you come down to the police academy? I'd like to show you something. And I said, sure. And I dropped down to the police academy, and he was cleaning out some files. And underneath the bottom drawer were several pieces of paper that were clipped together with a rusty paper clip. With the rusted paper clip rusted to the paper, the papers had not been separated in years. What you had was a description of casualties that were what we later referred to as KIAs. And there were 300 plus on these 6 pieces of paper. There is absolutely no question in my mind that of all of the horrible race riots we've had in this country, Watts, 1968, Detroit, 1942, none of them have even approached the casualty levels of Tulsa of 1921.
There was definitely a cover-up or a suppression of the material. For example, the article, the inflammatory article, "To Lynch Negro Tonight," has vanished, disappeared. It's not in the Oklahoma Historical Society, it's not in the newspaper archives. In the microfilming of the Tulsa Tribune records, it's been excised and can't be found. Now, some people would, and have, said down through the years, why research this, why bring it up? It can do no good. And in fact, there has been some threats of real danger and possible harm to those who would explore the situation and would look at it again.
I'm not so sure that in many minds, black and white, that the cover-up was helpful in gaining some equilibrium. Whites need to be comforted that they had done no wrong. Blacks need to be comforted that no new wrong could happen to them. So, but those two things companioned themselves created this conspiracy of silence.
1,200 homes were destroyed. Another 320 were looted. Over 4,000 people were left homeless, and over 1,000 spent the harsh winter in tents. No one was ever imprisoned for his or her actions. Charges against Dick Rowland were dismissed. No one knows what happened to him or the elevator operator.
Would travel to Europe and see the ruins of Athens and the ruins of Rome. My mind went back to the ruins of Tulsa, which were somewhat reminiscent to me then when I was traveling, of the ruins of Rome and Athens and other places in Europe.
A big, beautiful Christmas tree was placed in front of the Red Cross Relief Headquarters. Now imagine, if you can, this huge tree brightly standing in the middle of a district which had once been comfortable homes, but now filled with little ones and little two-room wooden shacks. Everywhere, large piles of brick and stone, twisted metal and debris, reminding one of the horrible fact of last June. For the first time in their lives, the Negro children of the devastated district, these hundreds of little folks, were without their former comfortable homes. The resources of their parents had been reduced to a point where Christmas couldn't mean much to them. After dusk on Christmas Eve, a chorus of 2,200 voices sang their Christmas carols and the typical Negro melodies. Coming from the throats of these people reverberated through the night air and attracted most of the crowd gathered in the business section over on Greenwood Street. Whole families were there, men, women, children. It seemed as though the whole Negro population couldn't resist this chance to sing. Never have I witnessed more spontaneous outbursts of Christmas fervor than on this occasion. The crowning sentiment of the celebration was in a speech made by one of the leaders, who said, "Let us always remember the old Negro tradition. There's no room in our hearts for hatred." This occasion furnished what was termed as the greatest night in the history of the Tulsa Negroes. Mr. Maurice Willows, Director of Red Cross Relief, Christmas, 1921.
Tulsa need not feel that, it's irredeemable. That was just a mindset at that time. What we hope to learn from this ride study is the danger of having a mindset that would exclude someone based on race, religion, gender, or something. So we hope that we learn some lessons from this.
Some of our group feel their superiority over those less fortunate. But when a supreme test like the Tulsa disaster comes, it serves to remind us that we are all one race. That human fiends, like those who had full sway on June 1st, have no respect of person. Every Negro was accorded the same treatment, regardless of his education or other advantages. A Negro was a Negro on that day, and was forced to march for blocks with his hands up that day. It should teach us to remember that we cannot rise higher than our weakest brother. My name is Mary Parrish.
In 1921, one of the most devastating massacres in U.S. history took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The 1921 Tulsa race riots. The black community of North Tulsa, called Black Wall Street, or as whites called it, Little Africa, was completely burned to the ground in a mere 12-hour period. Over 1,300 businesses and homes were destroyed and completely ruined. 10,000 people were left homeless in the night. And to this day, no one knows how many people actually died. Accounts range from 500 to 1,500 men, women, and children, both black and white. This senseless massacre of human life was very carefully covered up by high city officials. When Black Wall Street was destroyed, a major black economic movement that would have affected all black communities in America was crushed and completely halted. Black Wall Street was the most prosperous and most thriving black community in America during these times. It defined the word nepotism to its ultimate form. These highly organized blacks worked together in the same manner the Jews, Japanese, and Iranians work together in this day and time. Black Wall Street was so prosperous that white oil men would come across to the black community to borrow large sums of cash in order to keep their businesses afloat. This very powerful black movement would have had an effect on blacks all across America, socially and economically, but 3,000 card-carrying Klansmen would not allow that to happen.
What you're about to witness will astound you. It will most likely affect you very deeply, no matter what race, creed, or color you are. And just maybe, this film will make us all take a second look at our fellow man and not hate him or her because of the color of their skin.
This is an actual account of the worst race riot in United States history. It's not a pretty story, and it's not being told for its shock value or to reopen old wounds. This material is presented because it happened 70 years ago to another generation whose story is pertinent to this contemporary generation. The true facts were completely covered up and kept from the American public. The date was June the 2nd, 1921. The place, Tulsa, Oklahoma. After the bombing, the Tulsa World headline read, "Dead, estimated at 100, city quiet." One of the bloodiest race riots in the nation's non-military history had begun. The spark for the tinder was ignited on Monday, May 30th, 1921. Here's the story.
I know a place that was sure to go. Now moving slow, nowhere to go. We had it all, we took the fall, fought for every righteous cause for our life. Oh, oh, we had it all, we paid the cost, countless lives that we lost for our life. Oh, like Wall Street.
During the early 1900s, Archer Street was intentionally designed to divide the city's north from the south side of Tulsa. Blacks were forced to remain on the north side, and whites enjoyed their separatism on the south side. Laws were passed to make sure that whites and blacks remained separated.
Anybody who wishes for the good old days probably doesn't remember what the good old days were really like. Because in 1921, the nation suffered from coast to coast from hate, and discrimination, and arrogance. And those were probably the underlying reasons. They manifested themselves in organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. But you can't blame the riot on one or two or three specific incidents. The environment is what caused it. You have to keep in mind that in 1921, the majority of the Oklahoma legislature were Klansmen. Almost every city and county official in Tulsa County, Oklahoma, was elected with either support of the Klan or they were Klansmen themselves. In those days, the Klan would have parades in downtown Tulsa, wearing their white sheets and their pointy little hats to fit their pointy little heads, that would last 4 to 5 hours in length. Now visualize the number of people that were involved in a parade that would last 4 to 5 hours. And all these people came from Tulsa. when you had a parade in Tulsa, a lot of people come in from other counties. But you also have to remember that 1925, there were 5 million card-carrying Ku Klux Klansmen in this country. So what was going on in Tulsa was probably the same thing that was going on in an awful lot of other cities. And if the riot hadn't happened in Tulsa, it probably would have happened someplace else. The difference between Tulsa and some other city is that we know how bad it got. And where we've gone since then has been a mark of our progress.
As I sit here, I wonder, with blacks fighting for equal rights and integration in other parts of the United States at that time, was it really a good idea for blacks living in Greenwood to integrate?
But what happened by 1921 was not so much what happened on the black side, but what happened on the white side of the city. Because you had a lot of veterans coming back from Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry and the Argonne Forest, and they couldn't find jobs. And a lot of these were white, uneducated, lower economic class folks. And when they came back to Tulsa, the Klan milked that resentment that they held for those black, prosperous businessmen. And the Klan did the same to them that the Nazis did in Germany in 1933. As a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting. You can make an analogy here that is historically profound. We had a microcosmic experience with the Nazis. The Nazis in Germany in 1933 blamed the Jews, and they persecuted the Jews, and they segregated the Jews, and they created ghettos for the Jews. And that's how they built their power, but they built their power on the disenfranchised and the disenchanted Germans. Well, the Nazis took over an entire country. The Ku Klux Klan, in this case, largely took over an entire city. And for that matter, to some degree, the entire state and maybe the region of the country in which they were strong. But they played on the hate and the fear and the envy and the jealousy of many of these whites who had felt that the country owed them something because they had fought in World War I. And here you have blacks who possibly didn't fight in World War I and were very prosperous. And you had the seeds for that kind of conflict economically. Now, socially, you had a different situation. Oklahoma is a very unique state in the sense that it's the only state in the Union that was settled the way it was. This was Indian territory. It wasn't even a southern state in the Civil War. For that matter, it wasn't even a northern state. It was a state that was fought over by both sides. In fact, there were 69 battles fought in Oklahoma, largely between northern and southern Indians. But when the state was settled, it was settled by land runs. Benjamin Harrison opened up chunks of the state, and people just ran over this land and plotted out their portions. Now, why is that significant in terms of the riot? It's significant because an awful lot of those folks that made those land runs were Southerners whose farms and lands and plantations had been burned by Sherman and the Union Army when they went through the South. They had no homes left, so they came west. And when they made those land runs, they brought in Southern culture with them. As a result, what you have here in Oklahoma is a microcosm of the United States. The northern half of the state is more metropolitan, in fact, politically, more Republican.
The northern half of the state was settled by farmers from Kansas, which was largely Union territory. The southern half of the state was largely settled by folks from the south, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas. And the state pretty much splits that way in terms of politics and economics and social development. But when you add that extra economic jealousy and envy to it, the Ku Klux Klan had a breeding ground. And that's the reason they were able to hold parades that lasted 4 to 5 hours at a shot. There were an awful lot of people that were more than willing to hate blacks because they represented something they wished they had. Little Africa was possibly the most prosperous area that blacks have ever collectively developed any place in the world.
Oklahoma was regarded as one of the cleanest states in the nation and cherished its reputation as being called God's country, or the Bible Belt of America. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Well, as I first stated, my husband predicted this that Sunday night at church. Them days we had BTUs. They about cut them out now, and we don't have no BTU. But he made a public statement and told them that this was going to happen. But we didn't know. We hadn't seen no sign. But after church and after we went home, several men, young men and stuff, you know, they get all shook up and everything. We had a dear policeman at that time, we called him Barney Cleaver, Uncle Barney. He was down there trying to corral them because the trouble was arising, and we didn't even know that, with this black man and this white woman. And they down there showing out down to police station and all, and he was riding this big old horse, and he was telling them, you know, it wasn't going to be none of that. But they had guns and everything, and some of them come clear out as far as Latimer Street. That's where we lived. And running by there, men, get your guns. Get your guns. Blood's running on Greenwood like water. My husband said, that's just a lie. That's what he said, excuse the word. But he told me, he said, don't get disturbed about that. Said, they running along with them guns and shooting and going on. And said, in the morning when they need them, they're not going to have no ammunition, and the white folks not going to let them have it. They won't give them nothing. So that's the way it started off with us. Well, naturally, women always get excited. And but we didn't have any children then, and my husband, he was consolation for me. He's the one who saw the vision. I didn't see it, but he knew he had seen something coming. So he told me, said, Rosa, this is it. Send them, said, those men just clowning. Said they won't have a bullet to shoot in the morning, and white people won't let them have none. So we went on to bed. And he said, you go to bed, I'm going down here and see what they're doing. He ran down on Greenwood. Come back, said, they ain't doing nothing, just clowning. He talked about them down there with their guns in their hand, and policemen was trying to corral them. So he said, well, we'll go to bed. He said, but don't tell them what's going to happen. So we did. And he woke me up about daylight that morning. He said, we got to get up and go. The white people had put a machine gun on that big hill right up there and pointed down on all of us down in here. And they was shooting like this, the barrel of gun that way. One man that walked and sold vegetables every day, I can't think of his name now, he was shot up there just a block from our house.
What you see here is the very famous Mount Zion Baptist Church, a congregation that survived the 1921 riots and managed to rebuild on the exact same location where it was bombed and completely destroyed exactly 70 years ago.
In 1921, a man's word was his bond. You measured the masculinity of a man by how much he kept his word. The congregation of the Mount Zion Baptist Church sticks in my mind because the year before the riot, the black congregation took out a 20-year mortgage and built this brand new church. And the Klan burned it to the ground. But instead of running out on their mortgage, instead of telling the bank, you're just going to have to take your losses, that congregation took out another 20-year mortgage and paid off both mortgages simultaneously. That's character. There were other heroes, too. Many of the whites in the southern part of the city had black employees. And those employees had become almost extensions of their family. In fact, a lot of Tulsans were raised by black domestic employees. And when the riot erupted, many of those families hid those blacks in their basement at great jeopardy to themselves, because if the Klan had ever found out that a white had hidden a black in their basement, the white family would have been persecuted, if not horsewhipped. Probably the two most singular heroes out of the riot was the Tulsa County Sheriff and the Tulsa County Black Deputy Sheriff. Willard McCullough was the Tulsa County Sheriff at that time, and he was the only sheriff in the whole state that had black deputies. His chief black deputy was Barney Cleaver. And you got to keep in mind, when that riot erupted around Tulsa County Courthouse, there weren't more than maybe a dozen deputies in that building. And Willard McCullough stood on the south steps of the Tulsa County Courthouse and told a mob of several thousand Ku Klux Klansmen who were heavily armed that he was not going to release Dick Rowland. Barney Cleaver stood on the north steps of the county courthouse and told the black crowd that they weren't going to release Dick Rowland. Well, you put yourself in the position of a white county sheriff in a southern state in 1921, facing several thousand Ku Klux Klansmen, and you don't have more than maybe a dozen deputies to back you up. And Barney Cleaver's on the north side of the courthouse telling a black crowd the same thing. I don't know much about Barney Cleaver or Willard McCullough before or since then, but I can tell you this. On May 31st, 1921, they became, maybe earned the right, to become world-class cops.
My husband told me, so we got to go. And I said, no, I don't want to go. I don't want to go out there. He said, yeah, you got to go. So you remember he had told the people he couldn't hardly get me out of the house. So I gave him a little argument about it, but I had to go. And I just had on my barefoot sandals and had a head rag on my head. And he said, let's go. We can't stay here. So we got to keep moving. So he got out there and he went to preaching to the people. See, we was very thickly settled in on both sides of the streets. And all the houses was burnt down on my side, on this side and that side, but two houses, my house and another. All the rest of them was burnt down. See, all those little people, every chance they got, they would stick fire to the house. And all that fire was burning and folks was hollering, some of them been running. And my husband told them, he said, don't run, said walk and stay out in the opening where they'll see you. And so won't nobody get shot. So the bunch we was with, they tried that and we made it to the park, where about noontime the bells come ringing and the horns and things. and somebody told us, said the militias are coming. And so T.R. told him, said, walk out on the railroad. We took the Middleton Valley Railroad going north and we'll walk to Mohawk Park. And that's where those people caught us. They was in trucks. It must have been some mighty big trucks. And it was full of soldiers, and the soldiers all come to Tulsa like this, come on us like this.
The Klan was extraordinarily powerful in Tulsa in 1921, but then again it was extraordinarily powerful throughout Oklahoma. As a matter of fact, during the 20s, Oklahoma impeached and convicted 2 governors, allegedly, of course, for other charges, but it was an open secret that one of the principal reasons they got impeached and convicted was that they were anti-Klan. The majority of the Oklahoma legislature were either Klansmen or supported by the Klan. But then Oklahoma was not unusual. States all across the country had that kind of influence in them. But in Tulsa County itself, there was a rather unique situation that developed. In the late teens, the Glenpool oil field was roaring. And that's just west of Tulsa County. An awful lot of money poured into this city. And the whites, who were the big oil men, lived on the east side of the Arkansas River. The roughnecks who worked the rigs lived on the west side. Well, there wasn't enough housing on the west side, so a lot of the roughnecks would come over to the east side and live in rooming houses on 12-hour shifts. A lot of people said that was due to the housing shortage. To a great degree, it had to do with the working cycle of a roughneck on a rig. Because roughnecks worked 12-hour shifts on rigs. The point here is that a lot of the money that poured into Tulsa, that helped build Tulsa into the beautiful city it became, was also poured into the Ku Klux Klan. And the Klan became extraordinarily well financed. With that sound financing that they received from those oil men who were sympathetic to the Klan and who were, in fact, effectively manipulating the lower white economic classes to their own benefit, the Klan in Tulsa had a lot of money to do a lot of things that other Klan claverns didn't have that kind of support to do. For example, they had a building, a headquarters, here in Tulsa. It was called Beano Hall. Now, what did Beano stand for? It stood for Beano Jew, Beano nigger, Beano Catholic. I think it's ironic that Beano Hall eventually evolved into a pig barn before it was finally torn down. The Ku Klux Klan was real big on providing character guidance, attitude adjustment, and behavior modification on anybody they disagreed with. Not only including blacks, but whites who they regarded as violating their standards. It wasn't uncommon for a white person, for example, who might have been going out on his wife, to be hauled out of his house one night and tied to a tree and flogged by men dressed in sheets. Many blacks, however, were lynched. They were lynched by such organizations as not only the Ku Klux Klan, but the Knights of the White Camellia. There were all kinds of super secret little organizations that were self-appointed vigilantes. As a matter of fact, the Justice Department itself created the American Protective League during World War I and made it function under the FBI, which at that time was not the FBI we know today. It was a politicized FBI. But the American Protective League was largely an organization of volunteer civilian white men designed to ferret out any individuals of Germanic descent in Tulsa County and watch them to see if they conducted any espionage or pro-Kaiser activities during World War I. The American Protective League was formally disbanded after World War I, but that will give you an idea of the kind of mentality that existed then. But to address your question, yes, there were lynchings. And to give you an example, several weeks before the Tulsa riot, in Wagner, which is a small town east of Tulsa, a black man had been arrested on a minor charge and incarcerated in the Wagner County Jail. And that night, the sheriff, or the guard or deputy, whoever was responsible for the jail, conveniently went out to get a sandwich, just as a crowd of people dressed in white robes entered the jail, took the man out, put a noose around his neck, wrapped the other end of the rope around the bumper of a Model T Ford and dragged him down the middle of Wagner, Main Street. And that sort of thing didn't just happen in Oklahoma. That sort of thing happened across the country. And there were many lynchings before the riot, and I'm sorry to say there were many lynchings after the riot. But there weren't any lynchings in Tulsa County after the riot that I'm aware of.
The men come throwing away the guns over in the trash. Every time I think about them men throwing them guns away, I laugh about it. As bad as it was, they was just throwing them away. They didn't want them white men to see them with no guns. So there's about 3 or 4 trucks of them. All them soldiers, they fell out there. So we're not going to hurt you. We're not going to hurt you. And the men just throw them guns away and everything. Well, the next order they got was to bring some food out there because we had left home without eating. And the first thing they brought out was just bare boxes of milk and loaves of bread. And my husband got in line like he had some children. He got us 2 loaves and 2 quarts of milk. I've been telling everybody I didn't like sweet milk, but I drank sweet milk. I drank sweet milk that morning with all these. And later on in the evening, they brought us another snack. Pork and beans was in the bunch, you might imagine. And then they got us word, all the women and children, they wanted to see us at a certain place. And we filled up there. They took all the women and children to this big place. I still can't remember where they took us. I know it was something like it was like a fairground or something, a great big stadium. And I got scared there. I thought maybe they was going to put the men over there by themselves, which they did. But I thought they was going to kill them all.
The interesting thing that happened during the riot was that the riot lasted almost all night of May 31st, 1921, and into the early morning hours of June 1st, 1921, before law enforcement authorities were able to get anything under control. The city police didn't want anything to do with trying to control the Ku Klux Klan. As a matter of fact, the chief of police, a man by the name of Gustafson, confiscated black vehicles, gave them to 2 of his crony police officers on the Tulsa police force, which I might point out, with some justification, was a politicized police force at that time, not the police force that Tulsa has today, which is a first-class department. But the point was, in those days, he gave those confiscated vehicles to those 2 police officers who went out and sold them to whites, and then they shared the profit. Chief Gustafson was later indicted for this and removed from public office in June of 1921. But there were many other indictments, too. And many of these indictments were the byproduct of National Guard boards of inquiry. Now, what happened in the riot, and this is fascinating, was that here you have a major war going on in the downtown portion of Tulsa, that erupted and moved north into the north part of the city, eventually wiping out the north part of the city, devastating it totally. And yet the mayor, none of the city commissioners, called the governor. Now at that time, we only had one 40-man ambulance company in the Oklahoma National Guard stationed in Tulsa. The governor at that time didn't know there was a riot in Tulsa until the next morning, because no city or county official notified him, with the exception of the county sheriff. The county sheriff sent one of his black deputies through the north part of the city toward Sand Springs. He got to Sand Springs to a telegraph. And keeping in mind the telephone lines were down, the telegraph lines were down, the railroad tracks were torn up, there were Ku Klux Klansmen standing on roadblocks trying to catch blacks who were trying to escape the city, and there were refugees as far away as Kansas City and Wichita and Muskogee, Oklahoma. That deputy got to that telegraph and telegraphed the governor on behalf of the county sheriff that there was a riot in Tulsa and law and order had broken down. J.B.A. Robertson, who was governor at the time, sent the adjutant general, who is the top military officer in the National Guard in Oklahoma, to Tulsa. The adjutant general arrived and immediately sized up the situation as being exactly what the governor had been told by that deputy. And the adjutant general mobilized the Oklahoma National Guard, and they sent in guard units from as far away as Enid and Lawton, Oklahoma City and Muskogee and places like that. And a lot of people attribute the troops that arrived were federal troops. They weren't federal troops. Federal troops were never deployed here. This was the Oklahoma National Guard that came in. Many of the survivors who I interviewed when they were still alive told me, frankly, the black survivors, they told me, frankly, they wouldn't have been alive that day if it hadn't been for Oklahoma National Guardsmen. Because the Guardsmen came in and the very first thing they did was declare martial law and threatened to shoot anybody who was found armed. They set up internment compounds to protect black refugees because black refugees were scattered all over the city. Their homes were burned. They had no place to go. And so they set up internment compounds around the city in various parks and places like this.
But the next morning, the different white people was out there calling for their Negroes. They maids and butlers and things. Because my husband he stood in good with his man. He worked at a rooming house. I'd said a rooming house. That they called it then a sporting house. But that's where he worked. And the man he worked for it was the Ardmore Rooms on 1st Street where he worked. Well, that man, the owner of it, he come out there calling for T.R. Davis. And when he found T.R., then him and T.R. come over there where I was and got me, and we went on home. So, but I didn't tell you, one of my husband's best friends was killed that day. While we was in that rush, see, he told him not to run and don't get in close places, because they would just shoot in that bunch. This fellow was named Willie Lockett. He and my husband were great friends, and T.R. said to him, "So where you going, Willie?" He said, "I don't know, man, so I'm just going." And he was on a horse, and they said this was one of their favorite horses of the Lockett family. So T.R. told him to be careful and stay out in the opening. But he was killed that day.
Every single insurance company that had a policy covering any kind of damage to homes or commercial businesses or industry cut and ran on their insurance policy because a riot wasn't included. The federal government and state governments didn't have programs in place to compensate citizens for being the victims of a breakdown of law and order. So effectively, the citizens who lived in Little Africa took the entire loss. The problem was that when we're talking entire loss, we're talking everything. There was no FDIC then. They might have had their money in a bank, and if the bank was burned and the money stolen, there was no way to recoup it. Jewelry stores in Little Africa were stripped clean. Furniture was taken out of homes. Everything was gone. And the homes were burned to the ground. So when we're talking about refugees, we're talking about refugees that had nothing left except what they carried on their back.
Yes, was a good friend of mine. She and her husband gave birth to a little baby that night, and you know, I guess they didn't have nothing to put it in because there wasn't no conveniences. They put it in a shoebox, newborn baby. But some people, you know, some people that day, you couldn't stop them from running. We had to walk because that was our safest way. But these people was running, and seemed as though that they set this box down where this baby was and to rest because people got awfully tired and they couldn't find it. It was stillborn, already dead. But they didn't want to throw it away. They wanted to take it home and then have a funeral. But they didn't get to. And there was so many things that taken place that day. Now we lost our best doctor the next morning. But they told me that he stood somewhere there in one of those buildings down by where that little 3 Cardinal place is on Greenwood. You know, it's a ruined house on that side, and something like that on this side, and then the brickyard. Well, they said he stood along there, and he just mowed quite a few of them down.
There were witnesses that an airplane crossed the black community by air and something was thrown out of it. There were explosions. The problem is that you don't have a cause and effect direct relationship, because Tulsa was piped by natural gas in those days, as it is today. And many of the homes were already burning. So from a more precise perspective, there isn't hard proof that a plane came over the black community and dropped bombs on the black community. However, there have been a couple of things we've been able to establish. There was a plane over the black community. There were things thrown out of it. There are some interesting conclusions you can reach from some of the available evidence. First, it wasn't a government plane. There were only about a half dozen planes in the state at that time that belonged to the government. There was no Air Force then. The Air National Guard didn't exist. And there were about a half a dozen biplanes at Fort Sill. None of them took off the ground during this period. But this was the period of barnstormers. It wasn't uncommon for a pilot who learned how to fly in World War I to have a biplane and to fly around the country and do tricks at state fairs and maybe take somebody up for a couple of dollars. That, in all likelihood, was what happened then. That a barnstormer who had his own airplane actually flew over the black community. Now, if he threw out anything, and if it was a bomb, it's perfectly understandable how it could have worked, because it doesn't take very much to make a bomb, particularly if you're a veteran of a recent war that had just ended.
Greenwood was soon labeled the Black Wall Street of America. It consisted of highly educated black doctors, lawyers, PhDs, merchants, oilmen, and entrepreneurs.
The interesting thing about this particular situation is that in North Tulsa in 1921, prior to the riot, there existed an area called Little Africa. And that was a mark of respect. The black business community was extraordinarily prosperous. As a matter of fact, possibly the best minds in black America had migrated to North Tulsa in the late teens and early 20s. They built a commercial and business establishment so prosperous that it rivaled any place in the world. In fact, the main street of Little Africa, Greenwood, was euphemistically referred to as the Black Wall Street. They were millionaires that lived there, and some of the architecture of some of the old homes in North Tulsa today represent that particular period.